Chapter 8. After High School Part 1. Fall Term 2011 and Spring Term 2012. The fall of 2011. My life got better in a lot of ways now when I finally got to leave my parents' house. I no longer had to worry that they would see what I was doing on the computer. Nor did I any longer need headphones for it. I also finally got to live close to the hood. I lived right in between Mariehamn and Oldham, and also quite close to Earsbuda. But the depression was still present. But it became more obvious that I was depressed because many older guys were gone, plus I'd finished high school. I no longer visited Ustra and Dragon even though I had more opportunity than ever before. I considered myself too old for high school. I wanted to grow up and move on to adulthood. I realized I had better contact with minorities during high school despite living in my parents' house in Grubbe and going to Midgård. Now I had less contact with them despite living in my own apartment in Lilljansberget and no longer going to Midgård. That alone taught me quite a lot. This is an LSS apartment, which in Swedish stands for, the Law of Support and Service for the Disabled. This is a regular rental apartment but I got it thanks to my diagnose. There are some LSS apartments sparsely spread across Lilljansberget. From the very beginning, I could easily notice if someone lived in LSS since I often saw them outdoors together with someone from the staff. There's a staff for all the LSS residents, who got their own apartment which is their workplace. They help the LSS residents when they want or need it. I needed a little help in the beginning since I was simply just newly moved in and inexperienced, but as time went I learned to do everything by myself. I got visited though by someone from the staff once a week, where they asked me a few questions in about 5 minutes. Then sometime in 2019 I think, it was reduced to only once a month. That's the minimal requirement for keeping the apartment as I've understood it. I've never been mistreated by them though. Unlike junior high, this staff has never questioned my relatively high level of independence compared to the other LSS residents. Since ASP got me this apartment, I realized it had had its pros all along. I came to the conclusion that ASP was pretty much necessary for me in order for hip-hop, the hood and minorities to become part of my life. It was also necessary for me in order to end up in the ASP class, and thus witness all of its misconduct. But on the other hand, had it not been for my false diagnose, plus all the luck I had during 5th grade, and thus all of my other unofficial diagnoses, I would have never developed any grudges during junior high, and thus I would have never cared about hip-hop and the hood. I would have been just as indifferent as many others with ASP and then I would have never gotten anything out of life. I needed the false diagnose and switching teachers as well as ASP itself in order to become who I am today. But otherwise, ASP alone had never taken me anywhere. That being said, hip-hop could have just as well become a big part of my life without ASP, like in the case of many white middle-class kids. And since I grew up on the west side, where there are hardly any hoods, other than perhaps Umeådalen further out west to a minimal extent, I was pretty much transferred to the east side, Bergum, Kolbäck and Brentis, thanks to ASP as well as my false diagnose. Had I already lived around those neighborhoods, I would have only been cut off from everybody there, whites and non-whites. Had I not had ASP on the other hand, I would have most likely only been just another average whitey regardless of neighborhood. I knew rather few whites from the east side through minorities, even though they're actually the majority there. And most of these whites actually came from middle-class homes just like I did. Hardly any of them lived in rental apartments. I also realized the pros with going to Midgård instead of Ustra, or Torren for that matter. I realized that had I ended up at Ustra, I would have never visited Torren or Dragon. I would have known the ones at Ustra better but the others lesser. Plus, I would have been stuck at Ustra all day. Now I got a fair taste of Midgård, Torren, Ustra, Dragon, and also some John Bauer and Prolympia. I also would have been safe from those girls since I never would have needed to visit Torren or Ulljansberget, which I never needed to do anyway. It was just that I thought I couldn't visit Ustra, plus I never considered turning to Athena. Now I realize I wouldn't have gained as much out of Midgård, at least when it comes to hatred, had I known that from the start. But really, visiting Ustra, without necessarily going there, and Athena would have been a whole lot better than just building more hatred, because along with that came more self-hatred and I also considered becoming a Nazi sometimes. It really wasn't worth it. I got enough of those girls throughout the years, and enough hatred that way and many other ways. And it was going to get worse during the 2010s. Much worse. But had I been too safe or totally safe from those girls, or never had beef with them to begin with, I would have never developed such a permanent hatred for the ASP class. I would have probably never rewritten all these rap songs, or at least not as many, and probably not even all of these lyrics from scratch. I wouldn't have been the man I became throughout the years and am today. I also probably wouldn't have learned to judge people by their deeds and intentions instead of race and social class before learning about the Illuminati. As you can see here, all this hatred became pretty much necessary in order for me to gain from my mistakes, just like it became pretty much necessary for me to find any higher purpose with life. Nowadays I'm much less dependent on the hatred. When it comes to Midgård, I'm just glad I got to go through 3 years in a normal high school class, plus that I gained so much out of life on all other fronts. Then it was also that I became more secure with being basically white middle class, realizing I'm at least a human being, plus that I got a better grip on the hood at the same time. This depression also made me less narcissistic. I stopped comparing myself so much with African Americans and other minorities. I started seeing myself even more as just an average white suburban Swede, who simply just had a life story and thus could relate to other individuals regardless of race or class. All that about hip-hop and the hood were still a very important part of my life, but it became so because of these experiences. It never became just a temporary teenage trend. During the fall of 2014, I realized another potential reason why I got depressed. I was called mentally ill during 2010 after having put up that website. At the time, I was just happy to put out all that information, but in the long run it only made me feel helpless and powerless. I became at large just a Facebook clown. Fortunately, I got taken more seriously gradually during the coming years thanks to maturity, finding new measures and becoming better at expressing myself. It turned around especially in the late fall of 2014 and the following winter when I converted. And even if I even then made an fool out of myself a few times, as a result of past immaturity and a sick sense of humor, people have at least listened the times I've told them something serious, which I did all the time. And most of all, they never snitched to my parents or anything. That's what matters the most. Going to Midgård or living in Grubbe never mattered. I've realized how irrelevant that was all along. I could as well have lived in let's say Berghem or Sophihem, right next to Oldham, and went to let's say Ustra or Torin and still been the same clown, just as laughed at and underestimated. I whined too much about those things back in the day without recognizing the real problems, which often lied within me, my behavior and my daily decisions. I've truly learned that life is what you make it daily and regularly, not just once like every 3 or 4 years. Then there was a lot in the air, nationally and globally, that we were all blind to see back in these days, and that we've all had to sort out with the time. Stigmas, pop culture, abundance, much of what Alex Jones talked about. This thing about responsibility, that everything was my fault, in the fall of 2010 surely left its marks on my psyche that helped destroy me not much later. I understood that real well already then, but then it was pretty much too late already. The depression also added to my Alex Jones streaming, which went a little too far for its own good. At first he got an iron grip on me and fit me perfect. He healed my soul like no one else. But later when I got depressed, I became that much more dependent on him emotionally and spiritually, besides the streaming itself. He became a straight-up, personal Jesus for me. On top of bombing FB with him, now I started bombing myself with him. Previously, I relied mainly on music, mainly black music of course, plus Malcolm X a lot. That in its own turn became way too black, like boiling hot coffee I drank too early. I got to experience this once again in 2020 due to the Black Lives Matter wave, and that was much harsher, less harmonic and inclusive than its predecessor. It ain't weird that it became a bit too white due to Jones, but it could have been much worse with someone like Hitler at the forefront. The coming years would become much more diverse and Swedish, plus offer a lot more silence and thus space for reflection, despite it offering a lot more noise and chaos also. Another salvation came later when I put away Alex Jones completely and soon later converted. Since my God/prophet was gone and that I couldn't possibly stream anyone else 24/7 like that and thus replace him, not even with Malcolm X, nor worship that many different individuals, like a Hindu, I was like, where's God at? That's right, up in the air and space, with no face, gender, nationality, ethnicity etc. I remember going through all the Dean Show episodes during the summer of 2011 in about a week. Like Alex Jones, it really fit my view on the Western world's material abundance and decadence, and the misery it brought, let alone my own. Then during the winter and spring of 2012, I found the Muslim rapper Qadir Latif from Buffalo, New York. It's possible I would have converted right around this period had it not been for my Alex Jones streaming and worship, but just as much should he have brought me to Islam already then. On top of the diversity and silence on the computer, I had also just left my parents' house, had plenty of empty time, and also made some miraculous discoveries about my childhood as a result of the depression, which I firmly thought of as God's plan. I felt like I was fully prepared for Islam already here actually. The freedom of speech I achieved during the spring of 2010 was indeed a huge success, but it also became a little bit of a prison of self-humiliation and lack of integrity. Then when I converted, I realized my mistake and flipped FB into becoming my very best friend even more than the previous years. I didn't become any less public other than that I quit news bombing, but I also learned the virtue of keeping some things secret, until further notice and permanently, and being satisfied with what God and sometimes also a few people already knew. Until 2010, I was way too strangled by the silence, stigmas and parental brawls, and the blogs during 2009 didn't get me very far. During this fall, I visited Corona 4 or 5 times, when enough people I knew had attended the event on Facebook. I appreciated living so much closer to that place now, plus Krugen, which was renamed Local, with a K sometime during 2011 or 12. The Friday of December 2nd became a special night. Corona got a visit from American rapper, Fat Man Scoop. He ain't exactly a rapper. He usually collaborates with other artists screaming repetitively in the background. He had a big hit with Faithful back in 2003 that I often saw on MTV. During late November, I started going to a place called Iris Hodder. I was placed there by the Youth Town Square and the Swedish Social Insurance Administration. The Square is some sort of organization that helps young adults get jobs and such. And ever since I moved out of my parents' house, the administration has given me about 10,500 crowns a month, about 18 to 21,000 US dollars a year at the time, on the condition that I went through some internship or course. This became my income, necessary to provide for myself and such. My income has increased gradually through the years. As of 2021, it was at about 12,300 crowns, about $13,400 a year this time. I was at Iris Hodder every Wednesday and Friday about 2 hours at a time, going through a course that would eventually land me an internship. Most of the time, I sat at a big table with some other people, almost all male, all of which had ASP. Most of these guys were 30 plus, some even 40 plus, meaning 10 to 20 years older than me. I instantly got disgusted by them. They all looked like space aliens to me. These guys seemed to be much worse off than my old classmates from junior high, which was obviously because these guys were much older and didn't get the same help as my generation. These people most often got diagnosed as adults. That means they spent their entire childhoods just being UFOs, without having any name or diagnose for the problem. And even if I obviously didn't like the place, I was already glad to see how ASP had affected these people, while at the same time I'd already managed to build a life for myself without the interference from the LSS staff or any other external factor. It was like I got to do junior high again in a way. It really helped against my depression. Comparing these people with the older people of color I already knew then or was going to meet later also strengthened my skewed hood versus ASP mentality, which unfortunately would become worse in later years, with Charleston and Trollhättan 2015 and Christchurch 2019 at the forefront. Trollhättan is a smaller city in Sweden with a population of about 50,000, quite close to Gothenburg. In October 2015, a school in the hood Krunu Gordon, the Crown Garden, was attacked by a swordsman named Anton Lundin, who had racist motives. He killed 3 people and injured 1, and then was fatally shot himself actually by the police. No free hamburger this time. During the same period, a friend on Facebook sent me a private message telling me he was living in Lilljansberget. I'd just seen him there but I wasn't sure he lived there. I'd been friends with him on Facebook since the fall of 2010. I met him the first time physically the last summer. He was a notorious criminal and about 10 years older than me, had been to prison for years. Due to his old age and criminal background, I asked him often about his life and what it was like being racialized and/or criminal in Umeå back in the 90s and early 00s, which I obviously didn't get to experience back in those days. He also wasn't registered to his apartment at the time. He was borrowing it from someone else. He moved elsewhere in eastern Umeå during the latter half of 2012. We kept of course seeing each other now and then, usually at random. He invited me into his apartment a few times, and also came over to my place a few times. I had one memorable weekend night at his place during the winter. He was throwing a party, where there were plenty of guests, most of which I knew already. I got there sometime between 7 to 9 p.m. First there were a bunch of girls. Most of them left after about an hour or so, and then about 30 minutes later or so, a bunch of gangsters showed up, most of which I knew from Krugen back in 2009. I ended up on a photo with them which got uploaded on Facebook later. During the party, I was given 2 shots of vodka, drinking both, the second about 15 minutes after the first one. Then I drank from a third glass all by myself at random. Then I got real drunk. I couldn't walk straight nor could I leave the apartment. But I could control my words, thoughts and actions, even better now since I had to concentrate not to make a detrimental mistake, obviously detrimental in this environment. I dribbled several rap songs just to see if I could remember the lyrics, which I did real good actually. I went home at about 5 a.m., and even though I was still clearly intoxicated, I could walk straight and leave the place. Then throughout the next day, I had a quote, hangover, if I ain't wrong now. I was sober enough to walk straight and remember everything from last night clearly. I even took the bike downtown successfully. But I felt a huge, cold cloud in my head, which disappeared after about 1 or 2 days. Those of you who are familiar with alcohol probably know what I'm talking about. As for me, I ain't that experienced with it. I'd never been this drunk before, and neither have I ever been this drunk since then. I've also gotten invited to people's residences in the hood a number of times, at random, since I moved out of my parents' house, usually during the summers. Nice and memorable as all this looks to be, not the least for me then, there was a dark side to all of this. And no, it wasn't just a crime in itself, with all that it brings. It was that one of the girls who bullied me at Brentis, and after that was a close friend of my neighbor, and she was at his house the first time I was with him, and then at this party. Of course, I didn't want to have any problem with her in this case. Better yet, it never got any loud. We talked a little, but hardly anything about the beef. But as you can probably understand now, Brentis's footprints wasn't going to let go of me very soon. And now that I had a neighbor who was a notorious criminal, and had been at my house and vice versa, I had to play low-key. I never got threatened. I never had to, because these people shine with their presence. You just know immediately what's up. And no, I never got involved in anything criminal. Better yet, I didn't want to get involved in it, as a crime victim so to speak, much less as a witness. You can try to imagine that, especially those of you who've also been there. The winter, spring and summer of 2012. Shortly after moving in, I came up with a new idea. I was gonna visit a number of Swedish cities and their hoods, all on my own the coming summers. Then I started planning everything, using SCB's thematic map for mapping out hoods. SCB stands for the Swedish Central Bureau, and is really like American FactFinder. The thematic map was based on the latest election and its voting districts. You could check out how many people voted for each party, how many of the adults refrained from voting, median income, how many were foreign-born, etc. That way, I could map out hoods in almost any city. I found this map thanks to a social studies class that I had during 12th grade at Midgård. I gotta thank that teacher for letting me know about this map. This summer I visited Skellefteå, Örnsköldsvik, Piteå, Luleå, Sundsvall and Östersund, in that order, all located in the north of Sweden. In 2013, I visited Falun, Borlänge, Sandviken and Gävle, a bit further south. In 2014 I visited Uppsala, Västerås, Eskilstuna and Stockholm. I spent the entire day in each city on a Saturday, except for Stockholm where I spent the entire week 30, July 21st to 26th. I also visited Södertälje quickly that week. There would of course be more trips the years after. In early March, I finished the course at Iris Hodder and then I landed at a musical store called 4 Sound. I was glad to finally be somewhere 5 days a week, not just 2. I worked there 9 to 12. During the same period, I realized I'd made a big mistake by not visiting Östra and Dragon regularly during the last fall and winter. Now it became even more obvious why I'd been so depressed for the last year. It was because I'd planned on abandoning high school altogether after graduation. That's why I remained depressed all the way until now. But at the same time, I thought I couldn't visit these schools now when I spent 5 days a week at 4 Sound, until 12. I was dead wrong. I could have easily come by on Fridays right after 12, and then have lunch at a restaurant, or at the school without permission. That's something I realized in April 2013. During May, the depression started to cease a little. One reason was that spring had come and that I started seeing people a little more often. I had walked around the hood every single evening since I left my parents' house, but I'd only seen people about 3 times. Now I started seeing people almost every day. I also went to Skellefteå on May 12 already. During early June, I started going to the gym hall Iksu, located 5-10 minutes south of Lilljansberget right across the street from Minerva Gymnasiet. I had tried to exercise now and then since the spring of 2009, but I failed constantly. At this point, I hadn't exercised at all since I moved in. Now I got to use machines and such which helped me exercise different body parts the right way. Now I finally got some control of my exercise after all these years of failed attempts at home. I also drank my very first cup of coffee at 4 Sound, on the Friday of June 1st. I had recently researched its health effects, learned that 1 cup a day is healthy, but too much can cause a caffeine overdose. From then on, I decided to start drinking 1 cup a day. I remember laughing a whole lot after the first cup. I couldn't make coffee at home, but I could make tea since I had a water boiler and some tea bags. My parents bought them for me when I moved out so that I could offer guests a cup of tea. I started drinking tea at home now on the weekends, but refrained during the school days in order to even out the caffeine intake. I had also researched tea's health effects, learning it's at least as healthy as coffee. I started drinking both in order to cut down the depression, which it also did a little. This decision would lead to major changes later. I worked at 4 Sound throughout the summer with a vacation of 2 weeks during the second half of July. Just like previous summers, I rode around the hood in the evening or night, with exception for Mondays and Wednesdays when I exercised at Iksu. But sometimes I could visit Oldham quickly right after Iksu. That's where I also bumped into people most often, other evenings and nights that is, just like 2011. And now since I lived in Lilljansberget, I could easily ride around all 3 hoods one and the same evening or night, in much less time. On the Tuesday of July 3rd, I turned 21. Then I was given a coffee machine like I'd wished for. It was a machine where I could make 1 cup at a time. Now I could finally drink coffee at home and thus both coffee and tea all 7 days a week. Now I could both even out and raise the overall caffeine intake, and thus cut down the depression even more. On the Thursday of July 5th, I visited Umeå's lower district courthouse for the first time. It was a rainy day and I'd just finished 4 Sound for the day. I found a folder with case documents from June. I also found a computer where I could search for criminals and their cases, without any detailed information though. The cases stretched 6 years back, meaning the oldest ones were from the summer of 2006. The folder also got switched every month, meaning that all the cases from June got exchanged for those from July in late July or early August. Then sometime during the fall, they put out several folders stretching a year back, meaning that the folder for the current month got emptied of all the cases from last year in order to then get filled with the new ones. I had previously found some cases on the internet, the first ones back in the winter of 2010 already. I can't remember what made me come up with the idea of visiting the courthouse, but I had since far back dreamt about finding a place where I could find all cases regarding people I know. I was stunned now when my wish finally came true. The next week, I visited the Court of Appeal, the City Hall, the Social Service and the police station, with no results. I also got kicked out of the police station. Then during the coming fall and winter, I ordered all the cases on the computer involving anybody I knew. I also ordered some famous cases, such as the one regarding a guy who stabbed his 7-year-old son to death in Tomtebo east of Oldham and another one regarding a guy who stabbed an old woman to death in Teg right south of the river, both during the summer of 2011. I ordered all the cases by email, and it was all for free at the time. During the summer of 2013, I finished reading all cases at home, and then I kept going steadily every week and soon later every second week to keep myself updated. Many times I felt proud of having met someone or some people right before or after having done something, or gotten released. I've also seen quite a lot that I've never found in the courthouse, thanks to me and everyone else involved always keeping our mouths shut. 99% of all cases have had zero effect on my relationship with others. Very rarely was I surprised to find out someone did something special or that someone had never been convicted ever once. It turned out I'd been quite a good judge of character all along. During August, I started making major diet changes. I had Googled up the healthiest foods. I remember starting to eat walnuts, almonds, blueberries, and dark chocolate. Then at the end of the month, I decided to get rid of all the sweets at home. This included ice cream, candy, soda, potato chips, and cheese straws. This also included juice, sausage slices, and tube caviar that I used for breakfast and pre-bed snack. The reason for this was that I wanted to get rid of anything that tasted sweet somehow. I just wanted the food to taste less, and thus more natural. I saw no health benefits in this, yet. I had always kept it restricted to weekends, but I didn't understand that even that was unhealthy. Fortunately, I was never addicted to them back in these days, nor did I feel any abstinence by refraining from it. First, I decided to eat away the sweets I still had at home until they ran out, but then I started throwing them away beforehand. I remember throwing away my last bowl of chips and straws. Then I emptied 8 soda bottles sometime during mid-September. I flushed it all down the toilet. Well before October, I'd gotten rid of all sweets at home. Now the depression really started to fade away. Later that fall and winter, I made even more changes, like adding raspberries, eggs, and spices, adding cottage cheese to all bread, exchanging white starch for whole wheat, exchanging margarine for olive oil, and later rapeseed for a period, exchanging the chocolate for cocoa powder, reading labels on everything I bought, which required a lot of additional changes there. I made even more changes which I'll get back to later.